Nigerian environmentalists opposed the government's plan to restart oil production in Ogoniland, demanding proper consultations with local communities. The region, heavily polluted, has been undergoing a $1 billion cleanup since 2018 following a 2011 UN report. Civil society groups seek $1 trillion for cleanup and compensation before resumption. In response, President Tinubu urged unity and collaboration for peace and development. Meanwhile, the federal government, through the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, has licensed an oil firm to manage 2 new fields in Ondo State's Elijah Riverine communities. That's a lot we need to unpack, and joining me for that, I have Femi Oladehin, Senior Partner at Argentil Capital Management Limited. Thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Always a pleasure, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, that's true. All right, so on the one hand, the resumption of drilling sort of signals potential, the resumption of production actually signals potential improvement in Nigeria's oil production, while on the other hand, there are unresolved issues bordering pollution and contaminants above set thresholds actually. What are your thoughts?
Look, Ogoniland is always going to be a soft spot on the Nigerian oil and gas space, given the history of that specific location, given the unfortunate incidences that happened prior to now. And I imagine that any resumption of production or operations in that facility or in those areas would always be greeted by some element of suspicion by the locals. But I think we need to put this into proper perspective, given some of the initiatives that government has implemented in the last few years, and also the fact that the persons or the institutions that are looking to restart production in Ogoniland are completely different from the ones who created the environmental disaster that we've had in that space. And I'm hoping that there is, as the president said yesterday, there is an open mind on behalf of everyone towards ensuring that production is able to restart in an environmentally friendly way, and also in a way that takes into cognizance the history of the local environment and the touching nature of restarting production in Ogoniland.
Well, talking about that, the first question I would want to ask is what happened to the fact that there are rules of engagement, there are guidelines that are sort of meant to guide how these things are done in a way that isn't inimical to the health of humans and also the environment. So how did it get so bad?
So look, the international oil companies came to Nigeria, started operations and operated to a large extent with impunity. And most of that was driven by the fact that the bloodlines between the regulators and the operators always made it very difficult. We know that until the implementation of the Petroleum Industry Act, the NNPC more or less acted as regulator and operator within the market. And that meant that the IOCs, to a large extent, even though they were governed by the rules, were able to flout them without significant punishment. The regulatory structure under the PIA is significantly different, holds people to a lot more account on the account of environmental pollution, community relationships, environmental degradation. All of those things are now fundamental deliverables that oil and gas companies have before operating in onshore assets. And I think that fundamental difference means that we should expect different outcomes. Also add to the fact that the new operators of the OMLs that cover Ogoniland are Nigerian-owned and Nigerian-operated entities, which means that from a local nuance perspective, we expect that Nigerian-owned companies would be more amenable to working with communities to ensure that there is a clear direction as to where we should be going to as a group.
Well, talking about that, I like that you mentioned SPDC because I was actually going to talk about it. And I remember when we had the news about, Renaissance divesting and then Renaissance getting it, I asked you what will become of some of these issues that are, maybe you might want to say these issues that have been here before now. So are we sure that these new people who are going to take over, who you have said are locals and Nigerians, and all of that, how are we sure that, they are not going to be paying for the sins of other people that are no longer here?
Look, I mean, it is unfortunate that the way these transactions are usually structured, right? The selling party would usually sell on an as-is basis with very minimal disclosures as to historical obligations or historical. So you are literally buying what you see, and anything that comes up after that transaction, it is what it is. But I think that in accomplishing the transactions or in closing out the transactions, estimates would have been made and adjusted for in the eventual sale price to reflect the fact that there are certain environmental obligations or potential environmental liabilities that may not have not been disclosed that are likely to crystallize in the future. And those environmental liabilities are what these new companies have to deal with. I believe that these Nigerian companies are competent enough to be able to understand and estimate what those environmental liabilities are. And one of the other things that the NUPLC did in the last approval process was to also insist that abandonment costs, which are supposed to have been, provided for by the IOCs, that those abandonment costs now form a significant portion of cash that needs to be made available immediately. And I think that ensures that from a capital point of view or from a funding point of view, the environmental impact costs and the cost of restating the environment back to its original state is already provided for, and those funds are already in the bank. That in itself is a positive, and it means that we are unlikely to have the same problems if the regulator continues to insist on implementing the rules as is.
All right, so are these issues prevalent in other crimes, and how are they being handled?
So look, I mean, you have to agree that there's been a significant level of complicity in regards to how these IOCs have been able to operate in a country like Nigeria with impunity prior to now, and with complicity from government. It is only in recent times that the government has, stepped up onto the plate to ensure that environmental protection is one of the cardinal, deliverables of the IOCs. The truth is that in other climates, they are unlikely to get away with the things that they've gotten away with in Nigeria, to the point of even murder, judicial murder. If you were to remember what happened to the Ogoni 7, who were judicially murdered by the Nigerian government just to assuage a company who was operating in that area, But the truth is that in most other climes, environmental laws are obeyed, and the law, if you fail to follow those laws, there are punitive interventions that government is able to establish. I don't know if you recall that Mobil once had a massive oil spill in the Pacific region, and they paid billions of dollars in both penalties and reparation for that oil spill. But when it comes to Nigeria, the government has always looked the other way until at least the last two governments looked the other way when environmental pollution has happened. And I believe that right now, that is unlikely to happen in the new industry or in the Nigeria going forward, just because governments are now beginning to take their roles as important. And the regulatory framework is also now more punitive to ensure that any form of resumption of production when there's been an oil spill must be after such oil spills have been cured and the environment restored to its original state.
Well, do we have feasibility studies that show that, exploration can now continue in Ogoniland? Because we're hearing reports of, some tests that have been done abroad, and they are saying that the level of contamination we're seeing is a lot more above threshold. Are there recent, reports to show us all that?
I want to believe this. Look, and I say this with all sense of responsibility. The new regulatory framework that we have in the oil and gas sector is one that has proven itself in the last 1.5, 2 years to be capable of dealing with these issues. I do not believe that the NUPRC will issue a license to recommence production without environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments being done and being certified that there is the possibility of production restarting without further damaging the environment. Look, I'm not saying that we're perfect. I'm saying that the current regulatory environment lends itself to responsible operations in the oil and gas sector, and that if we continue to hold these regulators accountable and hold them up to scrutiny, they would have no choice but to implement the law to its letter. And I believe that implementing the law to its letter solves most of our problems. Now, do I believe that production should start in Ogoniland without completion of the cleanup that was started a few years ago? I do not believe so. I think it's unfair to the local community if that hasn't been completely done before, jumping the gun and starting production. But I believe that the fact that we're talking about this is actually in itself a positive step, because under the military regime, you probably have been shut down for just having this conversation. But today we can have these open and honest conversations about environmental impact assessments, about the fact that we must take into consideration the local impact of these investments in these sectors, and we must ensure that the environment doesn't suffer for the use of this technologies to obviously improve the economy of the country, but whilst not damaging the health and well-being of the people.
All right, well, we're supposed to have an environmentalist on this show, but I do not know if he will be able to make it. So let me put this question to him. This was supposed to be for him. Now, among other things, they are calling for that, let's get back to the environmentalists now. They are calling for a $1 trillion commitment for cleanup and compensation, the immediate release of a confiscated Saruwiwa memorial sculpture, and a full implementation of the UN report that recommended a comprehensive cleanup of Ogoniland. You've heard all of that, but I wish you could make it, but of course Nigeria happened to him.
No, that's fine.
All right, so I'm particular about a $1 trillion commitment for cleanup and compensation. I mean, how did they even arrive at that figure? Is that what exactly are they asking for here?
Look, I mean, when we bandied these numbers around, sometimes and I always understand environmentalists. They're wired to be optimists and just decide what they want and the cost doesn't matter. The reality is that neither Nigeria nor the IOCs can afford $1 trillion in any form of compensation or cleanup. But there are other demands in their space that, in all honesty, we shouldn't even have any debate about. The return of certain sculptures and just being able to appease the local community, given the damage that has been done to the environment prior to now. But again, honestly, I must still go back to commending the Nigerian government for having taken certain steps towards ensuring that there's some level of equity and, probably to a lesser extent, some element of return to a bit of status quo prior to the destruction of this environmental space. I would say that our focus should be that we should never let our country get to the point where an Ogoni repeats itself. So where damage is being done to the environment, restorative work must be done immediately, not palliative, but restorative work. I also alluded to in the first section of this conversation that the NUPRC is now insisting that all the investments that are required by law towards restoring oil fields, the lands around oil fields back to their natural state at the end of the life of the field, that those investments and those cash commitments are being set aside to do what it was intended for it to do, which was to restore the environment. And I think that those are positive, verifiable steps that government is taking towards ensuring that post-production or even during production, that there is already room being made for restoring the environment. Now, when it comes to the monetary compensation and all of that, I believe there were court cases that happened in The Hague with Shell and all of that, and where judgment was passed. I believe that the Nigerian government has a moral obligation to ensure that the judgment that was passed in favor of Ogoniland and other such communities, that those judgments see the light of day and they are implemented, and that the country is able to move forward and draw a line under this.
All right, let's move on. Now, the federal government has equally issued licenses for exploration in 2 oil fields in Ondo State, and that is set to kick off any moment from now. So what are your expectations from this?
I mean, look, one of the concerns we've always had in the last few years and before the implementation or the passing of the PIA is that investment in the oil and gas sector dwindled dramatically. And as a result of that, we saw significant curtailment of production. Nigeria literally almost never met its OPEC quota for over 10 years. And we felt that it was important for us to honestly move on from just talking about the PIA towards implementing it. What we are seeing right now is the benefits of a well thought out and structured environmental and regulatory environment, which means that we can then make plans as oil and gas companies or as the oil and gas industry towards restarting investment in the key areas where there is potential for hydrocarbons to be extracted from the ground. Now, I know that Ondo State has always been an oil and gas producing state. There is the fact that we have 2 new wells currently being, spud is good news. I believe that what Nigeria should be looking at is almost replicating this across the world, or across the region. We know that we now have a new president in the United States whose only, mantra when it came to the oil and gas sector was drill, baby, drill. We almost need to have that same mentality when it comes to Nigeria, which is drill, baby, drill. We need to get hydrocarbons out of the ground. We need to increase our gas production and also increase the monetization of the gas production. We need to basically get this industry back running at its full steam, so that as a country we can benefit from this natural resource that God has blessed us with, and also so that our people can be brought out of poverty. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is continue to encourage investments and continue to encourage production. So I'd say good news for the people of Ondo State. It's good for derivation. It's also good for jobs and the environment. And I would hope that this is something that we can replicate across the country, especially in places where proven reserves have been estimated.
All right. Well, I would have loved to go on with this conversation, but the drill, baby, drill you said is taking me, somewhere else, talking about, drill, baby, drill, and of course the withdrawal from Paris Agreement. All these will have, consequences for Nigeria, especially looking at our projection in the 2025 budget. So what do you have to say about that? Drill, baby, drill works for America, but we know the ripple effect it's going to have on, Nigeria. In 30 seconds, so we can end this.
Yeah, we don't live in isolation, right? If the US is going to flood the market with products, we had better be able to do the same thing. Even if we're not able to continue to ensure that prices remain above $75, $80, which is around where our budget is, the fact that we're able to resume production and increase production has to be fundamental on our mind. Look, this American government doesn't care about the rest of the world. They only care about America. And at some point, Nigeria needs to start looking at itself as well and understanding that the West doesn't want the best for us.
All right.
We have to do what is best for us.
All right, thank you so much, Femi Oladehin, for your time and thoughts on the show today.
Thank you so much, Perpetua. Always a pleasure.